Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and welcome to the first installment of the Vimy Foundation's new series of conversations titled Beyond the Ridge, in collaboration with the National Film Board of Canada. My name is Caroline Tolton. I'm a 2018 Beaverbrook Vimy Prize alumna, and I've just completed my second year at the University of Toronto studying international relations and health studies. I am very honored to be moderating today's webinar presented in partnership with Defining Moments Canada, titled Soldiers, Nurses, and the 1918-19 Pandemic. And we are fortunate enough to have one of Canada's experts on the pandemic here today, Dr. Kandace Bogaert. Dr. Bogaert is currently the Cleghorn Fellow in War and Society at Wilfrid Laurier University within the Department of History and the Laurier Centre for Military, Strategic, and Disarmament Studies. She completed her PhD in medical anthropology in 2015 within the Department of Anthropology at McMaster University, where she studied the 1918 influenza pandemic among soldiers in Canada. Some of her research interests include infectious diseases, psychiatric illness, and the long-term impact of the Great War on soldiers. Kandace, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Caroline, so much for the introduction. It's great to be here. And thanks to everyone at the Vimy Foundation for having me. And hello to everyone who's watching.
And a huge thank you to all of you in the audience for tuning in. I would like to let everyone know that the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar will be devoted to questions and answers. So if there's something we haven't addressed in our discussion that you're dying to know, write it into the questions box and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end. Now, I am very excited that our topic of discussion for today is appropriately the 1918 flu pandemic. I traveled to England, Belgium, and France back in 2018 to study the First and Second World Wars through the Beaverbrook Vimy Prize. And that experience of studying in Europe rekindled my interest in military history, as well as the societal developments accompanying military conflict, including the 1918 flu pandemic, which of course occurred during and right after the First World War. I think it's very appropriate that we're talking about the 1918 pandemic right now. With the current COVID-19 situation especially, it's interesting to learn more about the pandemic and explore its similarities and relevance to the world's current state of affairs. But before we get into the nitty-gritty details of the pandemic, let's establish what it really was. So Kandace, I'll open up the floor to you, but before I do, I see that General Rick Hillier, the Vimy Foundation's honorary chair, has joined. So hello to him, and again, welcome to all of you here. So Kandace, I'll start with my first question. What was the 1918 influenza pandemic, and what did it look like?
So the 1918 flu pandemic was a global outbreak of disease. So to clarify some of the terms we're hearing almost every day now, an epidemic is more cases of a particular illness than we would expect in a given place and time. And a pandemic is this, but on a much wider geographic scale. So the 1918 flu pandemic circulated the globe in 3 pandemic waves, beginning in the spring of 1918. And some people listening in might know it by its other name, the Spanish influenza pandemic. The 1918 flu is suspected to have killed between 60 and 100 million people around the globe in just a few months, rivaling the number of deaths caused by 4 years of total war in Europe. In Canada, it's thought that nearly 50,000 people died, which is very close to the number of fatal casualties the Canadians suffered during the Great War. So we're all familiar with influenza as a typically mild seasonal virus, but every so often influenza circulates in a pandemic form, with an average of around 40 years between pandemics, with higher mortality. So you'll perhaps remember the 2009 swine flu pandemic. The last pandemic before 1918 was the Russian influenza pandemic of 1889 and 1890. And an interesting fact is that all known strains of influenza A circulating among humans since are descendants of the 1918 influenza virus. So some scientists would say that technically it's still among us.
Wow, that is scary to think about. When I think of the 1918 pandemic, I think of its sheer scale and death toll, and it is a frightening thought to think that the virus is still around today. Kandace, you also brought up the fact that the pandemic is also known as the Spanish flu. Now, that name has definitely gotten some press lately, and some people have even compared it to Donald Trump calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus. So can you tell me a bit about the name Spanish flu and how it came about?
Yeah, so unfortunately for Spain, imagine what it's like having one of the most devastating pandemics to occur being named after your country. Spain had an open press, so the belligerent countries during the war had strict press censorship and didn't want word of illness getting out and indicating weakness to their enemies. So this meant that Spain's papers began to report cases of the emerging pandemic, and then other countries began calling it the Spanish flu. So if we look back in history, this is common during disease outbreaks. So looking at the emergence of syphilis in the Middle Ages, the French called it the German disease, the Germans called it the French disease. The pandemic before 1918 was called the Russian influenza pandemic. So we tend to skirt around the fact that diseases don't respect national borders, and people always want to think of disease as coming from the outside, from others. And it's kind of unfortunate that the Spanish name has stuck around.
It's really interesting that the virus got the name Spanish flu because of Spain's open press. I think that just goes to show just how much the pandemic was influenced by the context of World War I, since Spain was a neutral country and didn't have as much censorship. So did the virus even start in Spain at all? I've heard different stories about where and how it started, everything from Kansas to China to Spain. So what are the actual origins of the pandemic?
There's actually a lot of conflicting research on this, but one of the interesting things is that all of these different origin stories have in common their relationship to the First World War. So the first long accepted theory maintained that the virus emerged in the United States among Army recruits at Camp Funston in Kansas in March of 1918. So Camp Funston was identified retrospectively as the epicenter of the pandemic in the US by epidemiologists. And an alternative hypothesis to the United States origins theory is that the pandemic emerged at the British training camp at Étampes, France, between 1916 and 1917. So this theory is based on the clinical reports of the Royal Army Medical Corps, which described an epidemic of purulent bronchitis among recruits there. And still other scholars have proposed that the pandemic emerged in China during the winter of 1917-1918, and then spread to Europe and the rest of the world with the Chinese Labor Corps. So Canadian scholar Mark Humphreys has added his support to this theory based on archival evidence of the Chinese Labor Corps spreading flu, misdiagnosed as pneumonic plague from China to Europe and Canada in 1918.
Wow, so which one is it? Is it Kansas, Étampes, China, or something else?
So we're not certain. So scholars have noted that without testing samples of viral materials from these contexts, all of these theories are based on circumstantial evidence. So it's possible we'll never know. But it's interesting to think about why we're so obsessed with finding the first cases. So are we trying to locate blame? What draws us to those kinds of questions? And it's also interesting to think that each community in Canada would have its own origin story for the pandemic. So for example, within northern Newfoundland and Labrador, in some Inuit communities, the pandemic was introduced by traders bringing supplies and coming to collect furs and goods produced in the community. So while it's not my specific research area, which is soldiers, the NFB short film, The Last Days of OCAC, directed by Anne Budgell and Nigel Markham, highlights the extraordinary circumstances at OCAC. So in the clip that Caroline is cueing right now, we can see how the community experienced the arrival of flu linked to the First World War.
Okay, let's try to play this.
Over the years, I saw a lot of hardship, but the events of November 1918 were the greatest test of the human spirit I ever experienced. That year, the last year of the Great War, we heard rumors of an influenza sickness, but we had no idea how serious it was.
Okay, we hope you all were able to see that clip. The Last Days of OCAC is an excellent film, and for those of you in the audience who haven't yet watched it, I would really recommend it. And it's under half an hour, so if you ever have time to spare, be sure to check it out. A lot of public attention about the 1918 pandemic seems to be focused on cities and battlefields, but it's important to remember that the virus affected rural and indigenous communities as well. That one line from the clip we just played really resonates with me. The pandemic was referred to as the greatest test of the human spirit I ever experienced. And over again, when I hear about the pandemic, I hear about how devastating it was. So why and how did the virus spread, and what was it that made it so devastating?
So influenza is spread by respiratory droplets. So one person coughing or sneezing, and then those respiratory droplets being inhaled by another individual, or through contact with the virus on surfaces. So the disease spreads rapidly in crowded quarters like schools, but also in the context of the Great War on crowded troop trains and in military camps. Research by Sven Erik Mameland of Norway suggests that not everyone was equally vulnerable. So people who were impoverished, marginalized members of society, those living in crowded houses, those with tuberculosis, or without access to nursing care were the most vulnerable. And there's a couple ways to think about your question about how devastating the flu was. And it was certainly devastating in terms of the total number of the dead, and obviously for families who had lost loved ones. But if you flip the statistics around, by far more people survived than died. And estimates vary, and there's heterogeneity between places, but case fatality rates, or the proportion of people who got sick and subsequently died, is thought to be around 2.5%. So that leaves around 97.5% of those who got sick surviving.
Wow, it's nice to hear that there's a bit of a bright side in terms of mortality rates. I mean, 97.5% of people surviving seems like a pretty significant portion. At the same time, it's still tragic to think of the people who did die. One comparison I can make is, as I mentioned earlier, I traveled to Europe to study the wars through the BVP program. And one of the things I particularly remember from the experience was seeing the seemingly endless lines of gravestones belonging to soldiers who died during the First World War. And it was overwhelming to hear just how many people lost their lives in the conflict. It was around 40 million. And seeing some of the cemeteries for myself was a very emotional experience. Seeing the lines of gravestones made the deaths seem much more real and helped give me some semblance of the enormity of the war.
So it's the same for me, Caroline. Seeing the rows upon rows of gravestones in Normandy when I was a high school student is one of the most memorable experiences I have ever had. So I'm really thrilled to hear about your own experience with the Beaverbrook program and to think more about how these two disasters are linked in the past.
Yeah, but the really shocking thing is, and the reason I say all this, is that more people died in the 1918 flu, around 50 million, maybe more. And it's one thing to read about such a big number in a history book, but for me, the Beaverbrook program really put it into perspective. So this leads me to my next question. What influence did the Spanish flu have on the outcome of World War I?
So I love this question, Caroline. And actually, Howard Phillips, who is one of the most prominent 1918 flu scholars, has recently written that without the 1918 flu pandemic, there might not have been an Allied victory in the war. And his argument is that based on the timing of the pandemic's arrival in different military forces, if the German army hadn't been stricken with flu in the fall of 1918, the Allies might not have secured an armistice when they did. But not everyone agrees. So some military historians don't believe that the flu had any impact. So you won't often see mention of flu in military histories, or sometimes it's just a very short mention. So I've included a link to Howard Phillips's article that will be posted with this webinar if anyone is interested in reading more about his theory.
Wow. Okay, what you said about the pandemic enabling an Allied victory is really interesting, and I'll definitely be checking out Howard's article later, along with hopefully many of our audience members. Now, I know some of your specific research focuses on interactions between nurses and sick soldiers. So can you tell us a bit about those interactions, and is there anything from your own research that particularly resonated with you?
Yeah, so one of the things that really stands out to me is how people went out of their way to care for each other in ways that went far above and beyond the call of duty. So for instance, when military hospitals were overwhelmed, nurses were asked to volunteer to go tend to sick soldiers in the hardest hit camps. And they did so without question. Nurses like Canadian Claire Gass, she volunteered to take care of sick soldiers at Kinmel Park in northern Wales, one of the largest military camps there. And if you read her war diary, she talks about arriving at Kinmel camp and surveying the military hospital and seeing such sick men, many of whom she believed would die. But she didn't throw up her hands and say, "There's nothing I can do." She rolled up her sleeves, and it looks like from her diary she didn't have time to write for days because she was working so hard to save these patients. So they really did whatever they could to help, and good nursing care was really the only treatment available. And so the fact that so many people survived is a testament to the care they received from people like these nurses.
Oh, I love that. And that's such an admirable attitude to have, not giving up, not saying there's nothing you can do, but doing everything possible to save patients' lives. And I think we see similar attitudes today with the current pandemic, and we owe a lot to our healthcare workers.
You're so right. And to add to what I was talking about, one other thing that stands out is the way that these nurses would then, after working these long shifts, spend time writing letters of condolence to the family members of soldiers who had died, just making an earnest effort to reduce the pain and suffering of those affected by the pandemic. So people really cared for each other. And you see this outside of the military as well. So one of the best examples from my students who researched the pandemic in Kitchener, Ontario, was the fact that factory owners hired nurses to go around and check on their employees and shut down their assembly lines in spite of the hit to their profits to protect their workers. And this is well before the advent of what we know as the welfare state. People volunteered to bring their neighbors food and supplies to heat their homes. And so this pandemic really highlights the idea of community and people helping each other in a time of need, which I think is something really positive we can take away from a global disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. That is really inspiring to hear. Thank you for sharing that. It's heartening to see that kindness and compassion can shine through even in the middle of a pandemic. And although the 1918 influenza pandemic was over 100 years ago, today thousands of healthcare workers are working long hours and putting their lives at risk in the fight against COVID-19. So let's explore the medical treatment side a bit further then. How were Spanish flu victims treated, and what did the virus look like from a sick soldier's perspective?
Yeah, so the only real treatment was good nursing care, although some people did believe that whiskey was a viable treatment option. Soldiers wrote about how quickly the disease spread, how fast the military hospitals filled up, and how hard the nursing staff worked. In letters, soldiers would often minimize their own trials and tribulations so as not to cause anxiety amongst their family members at home. And it seems from some of their letters like they worried more about their families and fellow soldiers than themselves. One of the best sayings I've come across was written by a camp commandant at Niagara-on-the-Lake. When he was trying to deal with the pandemic, he said he would take help from God, man, or the devil. And military officials were exasperated. So they had a war to win, and this pandemic is threatening their ability to reinforce the strength of the army. So they really had tough choices to make: continue recruiting and potentially spread disease, or stop recruiting and not reinforce the army. So we have the benefit of hindsight, but they did not, and these were really tough choices. So I'm also going to include a link to an article that I wrote for Defining Moments Canada last year on the epidemic at the Polish Army camp at Niagara-on-the-Lake, so people can read more from Arthur Lupin's diary if they're interested.
Wow. That's great, Kandace. Thank you. And that's really sweet to hear how concerned the soldiers were about their families. And I can certainly imagine military officials would be exasperated fighting a pandemic alongside a war, which is not a great situation to be in. While we luckily have no world war today, we do have a pandemic. So how does the COVID-19 coronavirus compare to the Spanish flu in terms of contagiousness and mortality rate?
So I really think that it will probably take some more time before scientists can answer this question. So the problem, and I'm by no means an expert on coronaviruses, seems to be gathering accurate data. So epidemiologists need accurate data on things like how many people have been exposed, infected, and have died. And while they're busy trying to contain the pandemic and get people tested and treated, so really working in a sort of crisis mode, it's really difficult to gather these statistics. So my guess is that we won't know until researchers have time to evaluate the situation more closely.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. It seems there's still so much we don't know about COVID-19 and we're learning as we go. But even so, as we try to stop the spread of COVID, perhaps we can gain inspiration from the past. So this brings me to my next question. How was the 1918 pandemic stopped?
So different communities had different responses. So remember in 1918, the influenza virus hadn't yet been identified. So imagine combating a pandemic when you aren't even certain of the causative agent. In Canada, there's no federal Department of Health, so public health is under municipal authority. And so the pandemic response across the country was really a patchwork of local responses. But in general, things like spitting in public are outlawed. People are encouraged to wear masks. Streetcars are sanitized. In some places, houses with infections were placarded. Public gatherings are banned, including church services and funerals. Movie theaters are also closed. Sound familiar?
Sounds very familiar. The masks, banning public gatherings, social distancing, we have all these things today. At least today we know what the virus looks like, even if there's so much we don't know. And it's very frightening that back then they hadn't even identified the influenza virus. So right now, the virus is inflicting a particularly heavy toll on our southern neighbor, the United States, among other countries. Which country was most affected by the 1918 pandemic and why?
So I know that within countries there are significant differences in the impact on communities. So for example, some entire communities like Okak are hit extremely hard, whereas other communities are virtually untouched. So in fact, the experiences of the Inuit community at Okak, which was the one we showed from the documentary clip before, so many people died there that the entire settlement is abandoned. So let's see if we can show another clip from the last days of Okak, which you can watch on the Vimy Foundation's website.
Okay, here is the clip.
They had been infected by Spanish influenza. After the disease had run its course, Okak was nearly wiped out. The records of the Moravian missionaries and the recollections of the survivors tell the story of the last days of Okak.
Okay.
So Okak is devastated, but in some other places, communities are relatively untouched. So there's a lot of variation in terms of the effects of the virus.
Wow, it's very sad to hear how some communities, including Okak, were decimated. But at the same time, it's heartening to know that that was not the case everywhere. And the film also features interviews with survivors. And while their stories touch on a very sad topic, it is uplifting to know that these survivors were able to help preserve the memory of Okak. Like the 1918 influenza, COVID-19 has spread rapidly around the world and turned into a pandemic. So what other similarities are there between the 1918 flu and the COVID-19 virus? And what lessons can we learn from the 1918 pandemic?
So I think some of the best lessons we can take away are remembering to take care of each other. So as we've talked a little bit about, people volunteered in droves, they helped their neighbors, they've got through it together. And from what I've read in the news, we're seeing a lot of this now in efforts to take care of people who are self-isolating, appreciating frontline workers. And another lesson we can take away is to tailor our pandemic preparedness to plans to help the most vulnerable. So we know that vulnerability during a pandemic is not going to be equally spread across the board. And mitigating the risks for those who are the most vulnerable is really desirable. So for influenza, this is the immunocompromised, the elderly, pregnant women, the homeless, otherwise marginalized people. And it's really interesting to think about how a situation like the 1918 flu pandemic would play out today. And it's really hard to extrapolate because things are so different now. In 1918, many people died of secondary bacterial infections, which could be treatable now. We're also not at war, and social norms and values have changed drastically. So in 2020, we have a federal Department of Health, we have health insurance coverage, hospital care is much more widely available, whereas this kind of coverage did not exist in 1918. So things are really different now than they were.
Yeah, luckily we've definitely made some progress on the medical side of things since 1918. Your message about taking care of each other is lovely to hear, and I think it's precisely at these moments when the world is being tested that compassion is so important. But let's move away from the global perspective for a minute and turn to Canada specifically. So how did Canada respond to the 1918 pandemic, and how badly did the virus hit here at home?
So again, this really depends on your geographic, social, and economic situation. So Anne Herring and Ellen Coral at McMaster University have done some really interesting research on Hamilton, Ontario, and found that mortality rates in the poorer areas of the city were significantly higher than those in wealthier areas of the city, linked to overcrowded housing, a lack of access to care, and co-circulating pathogens like tuberculosis. So anthropologists would call this a syndemic situation, where the social and economic factors exacerbate the effects of diseases within a community. So this means that it's hard to generalize about the impact of the virus across Canada because it's so different across the country and even within cities.
I see. Wow, all those variations and with the inexperience with the disease must make it both difficult and very interesting to study. Now, there's talk about COVID-19 coming in multiple waves. Did the 1918 influenza come in waves? And if so, what did that look like?
Yeah, so influenza pandemics typically circulate in waves, and in 1918 there were generally 3 waves of the pandemic, although this varied somewhat from place to place.
Wow, 3 waves.
So the first wave was mild, occurring in the spring of 1918, and lots of people got sick, but very few died. And in general, people recovered very quickly. And it's interesting because this wave went largely unnoticed or unremarked upon at the time, but has been retrospectively identified by combing through public health and death records and the like.
So the first wave is largely unnoticed, but then what happens in the next wave?
Yeah, so the second wave was very different from the first wave. And the second wave occurred in the fall of 1918 in Canada and was much more severe, beginning in the late summer and early fall. So it's thought that this fall wave spread to Canada with soldiers moving from the United States, and then east and west across the country with soldiers mobilizing for the Siberian and Canadian Expeditionary Forces. So 6 soldiers were unloaded from troop transports as they moved across the country, effectively spreading disease as they went. So then these soldiers were packed into troop transports to move them overseas, and the illness again spread rapidly in these close quarters.
Wow.
And the third wave, which was sometimes just as deadly as the fall wave, occurred in the winter of 1918 and 19 in Canada. And some believe it could have been ignited by the armistice celebrations at the end of the war, or people congregating in crowded households during the very cold winter. And it's believed that the 1918 strain of flu continued spreading in Canada into the 1920s, especially into remote communities. So think of northern Canada. And so it's often thought of as a rapid event, but it actually occurred over months. And if you believe in the étape origins theory, potentially years.
Yikes, that's scary to hear. I certainly hope we can prevent I certainly hope we can prevent a second COVID-19 wave as much as possible. But of course, that remains to be seen, especially with social distancing beginning to slowly ease up. Nowadays, there's a lot of talk about the detrimental impact COVID-19 is having on the economy, and we're in an ongoing economic recession. So I personally haven't heard too much at all about the economic impacts of the 1918 pandemic. So could you tell us a bit about what the economy looked like during and after the flu?
Yeah, so I think many people would agree with you, Caroline, that people immediately think of the period following the First World War and the pandemic as prosperous. So we immediately think of the Roaring Twenties. But the immediate aftermath of the pandemic is actually depression rather than prosperity. So economists estimate that the flu caused declines in GDP between 6 and 8% worldwide, and the depression that followed the war lasted until around 1921 in Canada. And Canada in 1919 was a year of labor disruption. So we see the return of soldiers, high rates of unemployment, and this is perhaps best crystallized during the Winnipeg General Strike, the largest strike in Canadian history, between May and June of that year. In December of 1919, enough veterans were out of work that Parliament scrambles to set up a fund to assist them, and they actually authorized an emergency fund of $50 million to deal with veterans' immediate needs, and $5 million on direct relief to those veterans. So hundreds of veterans that were out of work lined up in Toronto to receive unemployment assistance and checks. And these events foreshadowed the economic depression of the early 1920s.
That is very interesting, especially since prior to this, I really hadn't heard much at all about the negative economic impacts. I think generally when people think about the Roaring Twenties, as you said, we think of economic prosperity. So it's interesting to see that that wasn't necessarily the whole story, especially in the early 20s. So how long did it take for life to get back to normal after the influenza pandemic?
Yeah, so I suspect a lot of people are actually wondering this right now in our current situation. So research that I've read on the demographic rebound, so how quickly populations began to recover with people remarrying, having children. Population recovery occurred within 5 to 10 years, and often there was a marriage boom following the pandemic. So the economy began to recover into the 1920s, and the Great Depression follows in 1929.
All right, so while recovery took some time, it was perhaps not as long as I might have expected given the massive death toll. Speaking of death toll, I certainly hope this isn't the case, but I've got to ask, could the coronavirus kill as many people as the influenza pandemic?
So that's really a question I don't know the answer to. I certainly hope not. In 1918, Canada's population was around 8 million. So if we consider the flu and the Great War together, so 50 million deaths during the 1918 flu pandemic and another 61,000 due to the war, the total loss to the Canadian population is around 1.3% of our entire population between 1914 and 1918. So in today's numbers, with our population at around 37 million, that would be equivalent to the loss of nearly half a million people. So that would be much worse than the worst predictions released by the Canadian government. So we really hope our trajectory will be much more positive.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I should make the disclaimer that I'm not a mathematician, so someone should check that my math was correct there.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope we don't see numbers of that scale with COVID-19. And I believe the last time I checked, Canada is only at around 81,000 cases or so. So we're thankfully far from 500,000 deaths at the moment, like with the influenza pandemic. And perhaps therein lies a bit of hope. People back in 1918 and 1919 faced similar challenges and faced death on an unimaginable scale, but they got through it, and so can we. So to wrap up our discussion, I study both health and history in university, and I think this is why I love both academic disciplines. History helps us learn from the past and understand change, while health helps us learn how the world can better deal with illness. Not only is the 1918 pandemic a historical topic, but it is very relevant today from a health perspective, and there are lessons we can draw from it as we battle COVID-19 and other future challenges. As Kandace mentioned, the 1918 pandemic showed us just how important it is to take care of each other. As we fight COVID-19, I think it's important to remember that we're in this together. seeing all the support for essential workers, as well as all the people volunteering and spreading hope over the past few months, has really brought home for me the fact that we're not so different from people in the past. And there are countless other lessons to be drawn from the flu pandemic, which for me is really cool. I would like to extend a huge thank you to Dr. Kandace Bogaert for her wonderful and very informative responses today. But it's not over yet. We would now like to open up the floor to you, our audience, and give you the opportunity to pose your own questions. So you should see a chat box on your screen where you can type in your question, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So if you're listening in, please feel free to type in any questions you might have. Okay, I think we have our first question. Just let me pull it up here. Okay, so Rebecca is asking, did the influenza pandemic have an impact on World War II? Do you think it really had a big impact on the Roaring '20s, the Great Depression, and leading into World War II?
So I actually hadn't thought about its impact leading into World War II. That is something that I think would be really interesting to look into. And I wish that we could hear the questioner's perspective on this as to where they're coming from with that. But definitely something that could be looked into further.
Okay, thanks. Cindy wants to know, what after effects were there for survivors?
So I think that really depended on their experience during the pandemic. And one thing that recent research from oral histories has made really clear is that people didn't forget those who had perished during the pandemic. And it really impacted families in a lot of significant ways. So people who were left orphaned, people who had lost spouses, they really moved on as best they could, but they didn't forget their experience during the pandemic, and they certainly didn't forget their loved ones. So it had significant impacts in terms of family impact, and those people who were lost were definitely not forgotten.
Okay. Mike is saying 70% of Canadian medical services were dedicated to the military in 1918 to 19. You praise the work of medical staff, so on speculation, would a member of the military have a statistical better chance of surviving the flu than the civilian population?
Yes, and that is a really interesting question for a number of reasons. So you might expect a military personnel, someone who's in the military, to have been screened for their health before they entered the military. So they might have had a better health status before they were exposed to influenza. And then also when you're in the military, you would be basically guaranteed to have access to medical care. But civilians also volunteered to help in similar ways. I think I just emphasize that because that's what my research has focused on. And military hospitals were overwhelmed during the pandemic, just the same as other hospitals were. So for example, many military hospitals were not equipped to deal with the influx of patients, and so they resorted to erecting hospital tents and had to house patients in hospital tents outside. And so they had a sort of triage system where the sickest patients would be prioritized in the hospital, and then as soon as they had recovered enough to convalesce outside, they were moved into the hospital tents.
Wow.
So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, okay. So our next question is from Rodrigo, who is asking if there are any notable soldiers that died of the flu.
Yeah, so I've heard when I was at the Guelph Museum, actually, there was some speculation that John McCrae might have perished due to influenza. Some notable soldiers that I have come across, when you have their letters and stories, all of these stories seem notable. So when you're reading the diary of Lieutenant Arthur Lepan, he had such care and compassion, and he would stop at no expense to help the soldiers who were under his care. So that really stood out to me. I've come across some letters from a soldier who was at Kinmel Park, and his fellow soldiers who then wrote to his family, and the nurses who wrote to that soldier's family after the pandemic. So there have been a number of cases that really have stood out to me. And one thing that is super interesting whenever I give talks on the 1918 flu is after I'm done talking, people always come up and they have their own family stories of a relative who served in the Great War. And maybe they died from flu, or they survived, and they have these really fascinating stories. So that's really what draws me into this kind of history, is those personal stories. So it's kind of sad that we're online and we don't get to hear any of those today. But if anyone is interested in researching their own family connections to this pandemic, it is a great time to be doing it now, because many local public libraries have made online subscriptions to Ancestry available for their customers and patrons. So if you are interested in researching this in your own family, now is definitely the time.
Oh wow, that's very cool. And John McCrae, who you mentioned, of course, wrote the very famous poem "In Flanders Fields," which is great. Okay, so our next question comes from...
I haven't heard it confirmed anywhere, but he did, I believe, pass away from pneumonia, and there was some speculation that could have been what. Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. So our next question comes from Patty, and she's asking, what was the impact on nursing education?
So I haven't specifically looked into the impact on nursing education, but I have read some very great work on how the pandemic helped to really professionalize nursing and advance the cause of nursing within Canada. So I can definitely post some of the research and work that I've been reading on this when we post our resources with the webinar, so people can read more about that, definitely.
That's great. Our next question is from Renee. She's saying, Kandace, what got you interested in researching the pandemic among soldiers in Canada?
So there's really a lot of things that got me interested in researching the pandemic among soldiers in Canada. So first I had to get interested in the 1918 flu pandemic, and I had a really inspiring professor at the University of Toronto in Scarborough, Larry Sawchuk, who was researching the pandemic, and his enthusiasm and desire to, deconstruct these patterns of the pandemic in different communities really inspired me. And then I remember very clearly reading one of Mark Humphrey's papers on the flu spreading across Canada, and just seeing the level of detail that he had managed to collect on soldiers' experience during the flu, and all of the detailed data from military hospitals and war diaries and things like that really captivated me. So it's been a whole host of factors that drew me into it, and then a whole series of amazing mentors.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So our next question comes from Claire, and she wants to know, are there any good books or sources for information about the 1918 flu on the Western Front?
So on the 1918 flu on the Western Front, I'm trying to think of books that would come to mind, but I can definitely compile a little reading list of things that you can read online related to the 1918 flu. There's a student I know working at the University of Ottawa, and she's working on specifically the Canadian Corps. And so when her thesis comes out, I believe it will be available online. And so, yeah, I can definitely post a link to the resources. And there's a lot of books available on Google Books, but the only problem is that sometimes you can only read so much of it online. I'll try to post some open access resources. And of course, one of the partners for this web series, Defining Moments Canada, has tons of stuff online that you can access free of charge.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to definitely be checking out more resources after this. I find Spanish flu is so fascinating. And yeah, I think we'll be posting a lot to the Vimy Foundation's website. So all our audience members, I'd really encourage everybody to check those out. And also the Defining Moments website, as I said, as well as The Lost Days of OCAC, the National Film Board production. So our next question comes from G. Johnson, who wants to know, there are some people who have created or are buying into conspiracy theories about COVID, its origins, etc. Were there any conspiracy theories from 1918?
Yes, there definitely were. Maybe that's a unifying element of our human past as well. But there were certain speculations that the 1918 flu could be a germ spread by Germans. And so you definitely see those conspiracy theories then, and you see them now. So that question has a very short answer, but yes, definitely.
Are there any specific conspiracy theories that come to mind?
So just that it was a germ spread by the Germans,
right? Just
that it was being intentionally spread, and I believe that was speculated in some newspapers. But I would have to look in to find those specific sources.
Right. And the idea that it came from Spain as well, I suppose, could that be considered a conspiracy theory and the whole Spanish flu thing?
So I don't know if it was intentionally malicious, or if it was just because of the open reporting of cases in Spain.
Right.
So I'm not sure if I would consider that, but as a conspiracy theory.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so our next question.
That's a great question.
Our next question is from Gail. Do you think we might already be in the second wave? Perhaps in retrospect, as in the 1918 flu, it will be found to have started sooner.
So this is a great question, and I'll state that I'm not an expert in coronaviruses, but like the rest of you, I've been following the news very closely. And last week there were reports that earlier cases had been identified in the United States before the so-called first cases that had emerged. So that's not something that would necessarily surprise me. But again, we probably won't know until retroactively we can look back and try to identify those early cases. But certainly we're always in history pushing back the origins of different things.
Okay, that's great. Andre would like to know, in light of the many parallels and similarities between the two pandemics, are you surprised that we weren't better prepared?
So this is a kind of a loaded question. Am I surprised that we weren't better prepared? So we definitely have pandemic preparedness plans in Canada. But again, I'm not one of the individuals responsible for drafting those plans and making those preparations. So I find it very difficult. You know, we don't have the benefit of hindsight in the present. So I'm interested, like everyone is, to see how we can refine our pandemic preparedness plans moving forward. But I think it is great that now we are looking back to these historic pandemics to see what lessons we can learn, with the understanding that things have changed very much.
Right. Yeah, the 1918 pandemic has a lot of similarities, but also differences to COVID-19, I think. Like COVID-19, there's still lots of things we don't know, but I think it affects a lot of elderly people more than children and stuff like that. I think one thing I remember from studying the 1918 pandemic is that it affected people of all ages, and even young and healthy people. Is that correct, Kandace?
Yes, so that's true. There was a significant number of deaths among those who would be considered usually the most hale and hardy. So individuals who are around the age of 28 seem to be particularly hard hit by the flu. So infants, young adults, and then the elderly. Were usually usually influenza affects the very old and the very young would be the hardest hit. So 1918 was unique in that way. And so the mechanisms behind that aren't fully understood. So yeah, there are a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences.
Okay, great. So this question is from Alicia. Currently, people are seeking diagnostic tests as important tools for preventing the spread of disease and better understanding its development. How did people in 1918 to 19 try to understand the time course of the disease, or is it mostly retroactive analysis?
No, so they actually worked very hard to understand the time course of disease. And so they recognized it was influenza from the symptoms. So it was a very well-known disease. So when I say that the pathogen hadn't yet been identified, I meant the influenza virus specifically, but they definitely recognized it as influenza. And they even tried to develop vaccines, which is amazing. They developed a vaccine, a couple of vaccines within Canada, which is amazing considering that they hadn't yet identified the influenza virus. So they worked very hard to try to understand the way that the disease was operating. And there's a huge profusion of medical research that came out after the pandemic of physicians chronicling the course of the disease and how the symptoms progressed and how it seemed different in character during the second wave in particular. So there's a lot of research that came out after the pandemic, and they would definitely were trying to advance medical science through researching this in order to help those patients that they're trying to save.
Okay, our next question comes from Jeremy. He's asking, was a vaccine developed for the Spanish flu? And I think you just answered that, actually. Perfect. So there were some, and some even developed in Canada, you said.
Yes, in Toronto. And you can actually, it's so cool because at the Canadian Museum of Science and Technology, they actually have preserved a vial of that original vaccine, which I think is so rare. I think it's one of the only ones in the world, and you can see it on their website. And it's a very cool part of Canadian history that this vaccine was developed here.
Wow, that's fantastic and very cool. Okay, Yobi is asking, is it accurate to compare the 1918 to 19 pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic to the Black Death?
Okay, so I love this question. So when you think of the Black Death and the 1918 flu together, again, they are very different. So the Black Death is estimated to have killed, I think, something like 30% of the population of Europe, which is just astonishing to think about. And then after this, you have this profusion of art and literature related to the experience of the Black Death. So it really has persisted in memory as this significant event, and it really changed the social and economic situation as well. So in changing the social and economic situation, we see that in 1918, and certainly we can think of the ways that our lives have changed now during COVID-19. So it's really interesting to think about what we're going to see in terms of changes in society related to this pandemic. But they are each unique in their own ways as well. And so trying to understand those circumstances is fascinating.
Wow. You said, Kandace, that the Black Death killed 30% of the population of Europe. Just out of curiosity, do you know what percentage of people were killed by the 1918 pandemic, if you know off the top of your head?
Yeah, so I don't have that math done off the top of my head. I thought you were going to ask, so 30% of the population of Europe, what is that?
Yeah, just out of comparison. Yeah, no worries. Okay, so Michael wants to know, there's been a lot of racism associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Were there similar experiences in 1918?
Yeah, so I think we have to remember that in 1918, Canada is a very different country. So we tend to think of the war uniting Canadians and that they united to fight this war, but actually there's a lot of division within Canada at that time. So not just the French-English divide that we think about related to conscription, but there's also a huge influx of immigrants to Canada before the First World War. And many of those immigrants came from countries that Canada would be at war with during the First World War. So there's certainly a lot of xenophobia and racism in Canada during the 1918 flu pandemic, certainly.
Okay, so we have time for one last question, and this is from Maddie. She's saying, "Hi Kandace, it's Maddie. Could you comment Could you comment on the 1918 influenza's impact on universities? This is a huge question concerning COVID-19, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so universities in 1918, just like other schools, were closed down to help stop the spread of the pandemic. So people's educations were interrupted. And then on the other hand, students of occupations like medicine and nursing were thrown firsthand into this experience during a pandemic. So the experience was varied. But as a professor this term, I was very sad to not be able to finish the term with my students. And so it's had a significant impact, and a lot of students are trying to figure out now what that's going to look like in the fall. So first year students coming to university. Yeah, Caroline, you can maybe better answer that question from the student's perspective today, and continuing your education, thinking of first year students starting, graduating students having to finish online. You can think of these are huge impacts in their, life trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks for that question, Maddie.
All right, so it seems we have run out of time, but I would like to thank you all for your amazing questions, and thank you so much for tuning in. I would also like to once again thank Dr. Kandace Bogaert for her time and her insightful answers. Thanks also to our series partner, the National Film Board of Canada, for the short film clips from the last days of OCAC, which we saw today, and to our webinar partner, Defining Moments Canada. Defining Moments Canada is dedicated to recognizing key moments in Canadian history through storytelling and empowering history educators across the country. Their website contains lesson plans and historical resources, such as articles, microhistories, and a story map about Canada and the 1918 to 19 influenza epidemic, including work by our panelists today, Dr. Kandace Bogaert. They also have resources on the site about D-Day and VE Day, and are currently developing a project to commemorate the 100th anniversary of insulin, another great Canadian discovery. We hope you have enjoyed the webinar, and stay tuned because this is only the first installment in the Vimy Foundation's Beyond the Ridge webinar series, and there is more to come. So thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great afternoon. Bye.